This is our second lecture in the Philippines chapter of what will be Volume 3, Communism in East Asia, in next year's book, The ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2018. And in the series of lectures, this is Lecture 58B. I call it Karl Marx and the Chiefdom Transition to Slave Stage Kingdoms. And mostly what we're going to be talking about today are the chiefdoms of the Philippines. So we have two subjects really, the subject of Marxist theory on chiefdoms and the subject of the chiefdoms themselves. Taking the last one first, there's a professor named Laura Lee Junker who is the controlling authority on the question of archaeological data and ethno-historical data of chiefdoms in the Philippines. And she has written innumerable articles about that. But I think probably one book that if you wanted to get it would be the most important to you, pull out of the library, would be called, of hers is Raiding, Trading, and Feastings, The Political Economy of the Philippine Chiefdoms, published in 1999 by the University of Illinois at Chicago. And that is the controlling authorities for this particular set of lectures on the chiefdoms. As for the Marxist theory, I assume that you'd already realize that this book is the controlling authority. At any rate, primitive communism in its final tribal agricultural stage gave rise to, first of all, simple chiefdoms, and in turn, as these polities exhausted their structural potential and required reinforcement, they gave rise to, thirdly, the advanced theocratic chiefdom stage societies. And in the Philippines, of particular importance are the Isnek and the Kalinga, which are socially ranked societies of this ATC form. These in turn transformed by the now well understood internal processes to the slave stage. And thirdly, the kingdom of Ifugao Cordillera Highlanders that occupied the mountain ranges of Luzon and the harbor kingdoms that grew along rivers and seashores, whose ruling classes owed their wealth to inter-island maritime trade. Now, first of all, we'll discuss the simple chiefdom stage. Now, you may recall from Volume 1, where we had a chapter on simple chiefdoms, that there is a way to handle the newly emergent general crisis within the stage of tribal agriculture without moving on, slashing and burning, and starting all over again. There is a lifestyle strategy that allows resolution of the general crisis while staying within the constraints of the general contradiction of the first egalitarian epoch. That other way meant staying in place, building an irrigation system, fertilizing the fields, and intensifying production of both animals and agriculture. In this other way, each family would intensify its farm's reliance upon gardens and pens. This is what we in archaeology call a simple chiefdom way. The details can be understood if one studies Marshall Solid's classic book, Stone Age Economics. Now, Karl Marx identified the chiefdom stage as the locus of class division and state emergence. You may recall that Karl Marx explained in his ethnological notebooks his views on chiefdoms as based on the then and newly available ethnographic data. Looking at the ethnographic accounts of the living remnants of chiefdoms and sociocultural evolution, Marx found the point where society began to abandon primitive communism. From this chiefdom stage, society marched into the historical stages of slavery, feudalism, and capitalism, and more specifically through two transitional chiefdom stages. He says this clearly in his now published ethnological notebooks. Archaeology, as we have seen, has proven him correct in this regard, and furthermore, archaeology has provided us the details of the prehistoric transition. We have to understand the meaning of the archaeological data, of course, and that is now what I will explain. Beginning with the proto-commoditization of labor time that is proceeding apace. The simple chiefdom way required the professional specialization of some individual producers. Part of this division of labor along professional specialist lines was the marking of commodity production with an abstracted sense of the amount of socially necessary labor time required to create each unit commodity. or article of production, in this case, in the productive process. Thus, the simple chiefdom way is also the point in history where we have regular proto-commoditization of labor time, evolving naturally from what had gone before in the advanced hunting-gathering bands and tribes. Concrete labor time has become abstracted into socially necessary labor time in at least some component, small or large, of the new way of doing things. Some people contribute their part of the de facto social contract by farming. That is, tilling, planting, harvesting, caring for the fields of whatever grass domesticate, for example, wheat, oats, barley, rice, millet, rice, and corn, while others work full-time producing pottery, textiles, and stone tools. The center, that is, the chief and her consigliere, arrange for the collection and redistribution of the goods produced. This has become a constant or regular feature of social production. Professional specialization has been creating ranks within society, and among them the maturing, if still embryonic, forms of what will become classes once classes exist. Now we have professional specialization, social ranks, and social classes. We cannot homogenize and thus categorize the labor time input of all of these professional specialist contributors along the same lines allowed by a factory clock, such as regulates production per unit time in a capitalist or socialist factory. But we can see the proto-emergence of abstracted socially necessary labor time as an economic category. These societies mobilize people for a collective labor input to undertake certain large social tasks. In the Americas, we see this in the construction of bison drive lanes, village chapels, cliff-dwelling apartment blocks. We see this in the Philippines in the construction of fishing net complexes. In all cases, we have the creation of X amount of product per unit time as the focus of economic endeavor. Observers of prehistoric socio-cultural evolution are looking at the first faltering proto-steps that will, as a category, transform into the abstracted socially necessary labor time involved in commodity production in the future. Underlying this shift in the hub of centralized reciprocal movement of goods and services, from the tribal council to the sole chief, may be a new motivation. If the time has come in people's perception that there is a non-altruistic way of doing things, a selfish way, then there is a new kind of basal psychological imprinting. For the first time in all of human history, there is a new kind of basal psychological imprinting. Now, the time will have come when infants and children recognize that no matter what mom and dad and the parental generation said about sharing, in reality, some families were better off than others. The concomitant logical conclusion must have been that some professions might also be better situated in life than others. Something different from altruism is on the ideological horizon. It is selfishness, and that will become the new ideological template of the new epic, that is, the servitude epic. When the ideological template of selfishness is extant, so is the superstructural preparation for a new epic. This parallel developing superstructural tendency is accompanying the move from professional specialization and social ranks to social classes and their state apparatus. From altruism to selfishness and sadism, it is inherent within a system where some people are supported by the social surplus of the tribal council, that the differential in reward becomes part of what is imprinted as the nature of the real world. Some people may clear fields, dig ditches, build dams, and others make pottery and textiles for those who do not have the time, and the reward will be different. It will be different even if, in an ideal situation, the labor input of all of the contributors were exactly equal, because it may not appear so. Individuals may and often do have different values about work and reward. The perception that one individual's path in life may be superior to another person's, for said person's very personal benefit, has taken hold for the first time in 5 million years. In reality, it could never have been more than a matter of time until perception truly did reflect the objective fact that some professions offered more reward than others for the same amount of input. It only takes one person so imprinted with the desire to be on the better end of the stick to begin to agitate for a solution to the general crisis of tribal agriculture that is not of the egalitarian, moving on, start over, slash and burn tradition. Such persons might pose the question, why not stay in our homeland and make our production more efficient? Commitment to efficiency in production does have many advantages. All that unnecessary and sometimes dangerous moving is eliminated. People get to stay where they feel at home and comfortable, and for a while the actual results will be better for everyone. Efficient field agriculture and stockyard husbandry will produce more surplus at a lower labor time input per person. Note how complex the surplus column has now become. Now that's a reference to the formula in your textbook, which will be in this volume, but which is also in volume 1, where we have, just to go over it again, when you look at your textbook in the chapter on simple chiefdoms, or the chapter on tribal agriculture, or advanced theocratic chiefdoms, you'll see that we have labor plus labor power, that is concrete individual laboring activity plus labor power as a prototype, plus technology, that is an arrow leading to technology, and that equals value 1 and value 2, which is the cost of supporting the workers, and volume 2, which is the cost of replacing and maintaining the technology, plus surplus, and everything over what's required for the value 1 and value 2 is what we call surplus. So when I say how complex the surplus column has now become, it's a reference to that, and it would be a good idea perhaps for you to go and take a look at that in the chapter in volume 1. The general crisis has emerging features such as surplus constantly on hand as a fundamental reality and necessity, yet its division will be a source of great social friction when there is too much or too little social product. In other words, under the surplus we have storage and slash support, neither too much or too little. Now that's the contradiction. That is the general crisis, which is the engine driving the stage. Now, and I just defined some of those terms for you, but at any rate it'll be useful for you to take a look at the equation, the formula. One must have enough surpluses to supply necessary demand, but no more. That extra social product above the agreed minimum personal maintenance needs is collected by the chief and stored in her central warehouse, not in the family farms. Potential inequality is eliminated and the needed surplus obtained simultaneously. Or in other words, you can't have surplus, even though you need it, you can't have it being accumulated in the family farms. It's going to have to go to a center. Because if you have it accumulated in the family farms, then you're going to have some farms better off than others, and this is the source of centrifugal social forces that will dissolve society. By centralizing the collection of everything above what is needed per person in each farm, that equalizes everything out, and at the same time society as a whole has gotten, hopefully, enough surplus that will handle problems which may come up. Now, instead of avoiding the enemy within, envy, jealousy, coveting, by evading surplus production, one is now saying maximize surplus production, because with honest central collection and efficient one-woman administration, we will all still be equal. And the reason I say woman instead of man is because most of these societies, the chiefs were women. Now, however, on this course and in a few more steps and centuries, the maximizing of surplus production will occur far beyond necessary amounts because A, society has been dividing into special interest groups through professional specialization, which constitute de facto ranks of differing access to both the articles of production and the means of production. These ranks are the necessary result of the simple fact that with the professional specialization of individual concrete labor, some professions are economically and politically better off than others, and secondly, under a non-egalitarian ideology has firmly taken root. So B, the effect has been that the higher ranks of society, now selfishly motivated, want to maximize production to take more as profit for themselves. The general contradiction of the servitude epoch is on the horizon. The concept of profit now appears for the first time. The coming general contradiction of the servitude epoch is camouflaged by all the talk about how what we call the general crisis can be more efficiently handled. The archaeological record is universally in line with this interpretation. Everywhere without exception where we have continuous sequence of sociocultural evolution in the ground, we see the transition from tribal agriculture to simple chiefdoms happened exactly this way. Especially important is that transition in Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, Mesoamerica, and Peru, because these are the 5 areas of continuous origin and evolution of society from hunting and gathering primitive communism through to the slave stage, and of course this happened in Indochina and the Philippines. And just a side comment here, when you take, at the time of contact, when the Spanish arrived in the Philippines, advanced theocratic chiefdoms were the most important single kind of socio-cultural polity within that country, and that was all cut short by the Spanish occupation. They imposed their religion and their ways on the Philippines, just as they had in the New World. But what you also had in the Philippines was the remnants of all of the collapse phases which had occurred. Not everybody made it successfully, for example, from simple chiefdoms to advanced theocratic chiefdoms. So you had people that had moved away from the societies that were simple chiefdoms, that because they could, there was nobody there to force them to stay, and they had taken up, again, tribal agriculture. There were people that had never joined or now went back to hunting and gathering in the forest. So the landscape of the Philippines Islands looks like a radioactive decay landscape in terms, if you want to think of the decay of social formations all over the place. Well, at any rate, efficiency in tribal agriculture can be enhanced by disciplined organization of the various productive tasks that come with the professional specialization of labor. As part of this process, one chief is elected to replace the tribal council, now relegated to the role of consigliere. In other words, the chief may have consigliere from the clans. The political change from group leadership to that of one person is a revolution in social organization tending toward centralization and concentration of social authority, as well as surplus social product. Now, the small group at the center will have within it that one who advocated or will advocate this change for the ulterior motives of greed and self-advancement, regardless of the effect on the community as a whole. Not that the immediate effect will have been bad, it probably will have been excellent. However, to the person with the hidden agenda, this is altogether a matter of fortune. He or she can turn to their advantage in selling the new way. This soldier of fortune's concern is with herself, not them, and being in the center of the reciprocal movement of goods and services means you can pull some of it out of the cash flow, as you will, to do as you wish. The farther one goes down the road of efficiency by the way of disciplined professional specialization of labor, the further one has traveled along the road of social revolution. The chief collects the surpluses and assigns different persons to new tasks, such as full-time irrigation and dam building, then full-time pottery and textile production for the new rank of irrigation workers and dam builders. The more labor time that is actually specialized or truly commoditized, now as numbers of people are assigned to specific tasks where their labor time is socially necessary and abstracted, the better the results in the production of both value and surplus social product, which is including proto-surplus value. The chief and her family, her helpers, and cohorts from the clans now constitute a special rank themselves, as do the farming families, the professional specialist families, and the priests and priestesses who convince the rubes that all this is divinely inspired. A society of ranks has replaced a society of equals. That is to say, tribes and simple chiefdoms, where democratic inclinations were more powerful, moved into areas where they could stay with the old ways, where the rubes could slash and burn to their heart's content and live happily ever after, such as the vast steppe lands of the Russian West, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe. Now, these ranks have special interests. It is inevitable that social ranks will become antagonistic, if for no other reason than the vagaries of primitive agriculture and animal husbandry. The exigencies of Stone Age economics will create a severe shortage of surplus, leaving the central granaries depleted. When struck by hail, rain, flooding, drought, locusts, disease, war, or raiding, who is going to get the shit end of the stick when the chief's warehouse is approaching bankruptcy? When the granaries are full, which groups to stand to benefit more? The general crisis of the simple chiefdom stage comes from the growing need for professional specialization of labor on the one hand, and on the other, the concomitant need to offset the tendency toward social dissolution. And this was why we have the emergence of a new stage of general crises. This is implicit in any society split between different special interest groups with inherently different interests. One must either stop fragmenting society and return to the simpler tribal agricultural way of life, or find some way to offset the dissolutional effects arising from the fractionating of society into groups of relatively discontented people. The resolution of this crisis will come in the form of a unifying religion. Shamans have become full-time specialists called priests and priestesses. They were supported in totality by the center of the simple chiefdom. Now, this was the first time in human history that a religious specialist was anything more than a spare-time practitioner of the arts of supernatural communication and manipulation. The job of these religious bosses was to support the increasing reliance upon professionally specialized efficiency in the use of abstracted labor time for those tribes and simple chiefdoms moving into the new way. Those simple chiefdoms dominated by the newly selfish few that did move into the deserts, where the most intense professional specialization of abstracted labor time was the only way to survive. There were more surprises in store for the ones doing all the work. But do not think that only deserts, such as those of Iraq and Egypt, provide the necessary challenge. The key word is challenge. That could be the challenge of living in intensely populated regions, such as nuclear China, along the Wangho and the Yangtze rivers. It could be the Arctic and alpine environments of the highland valleys of the Peruvian, Bolivian Central Andes. It could be the humid swampy lowlands of Yucatan in southeast Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. It could be many things, but the challenge is always so great as to encourage or indeed necessitate the extreme organization, perhaps quasi-militarization, of the labor force along professionally specialized lines. In the great regions bordering the Wangho River in the north and the Yangtze River in the south, nature provided China and humanity with some of the finest and greatest tracts of agricultural land with the most perfect climate. She provided any Neolithic farmers anywhere in the world, and we reviewed that in our previous lectures on Neolithic China. Conditions over these millions upon millions of acres were exactly the opposite, one thinks, to the regions of environmental extremes posed to farmers in the other principal area of origin of civilization. Elsewhere, the challenge confronting the early simple chiefdoms were deserts, or low and humid lowlands, or alpine and subarctic highlands, as in Egypt, Iraq, Mexico, Guatemala, and the central Andes of Peru. Areas that we have seen required this professional specialization of labor and the application of true labor power. So what happened in nuclear China? If challenge is always the key, and it is, why do we see identical sociocultural evolutionary trajectories in environmentally near perfect China? What was the challenge? And the answer is a very rapid population explosion of Neolithic tribal agricultural farmers over an area so vast as to dwarf any of the other foregoing centers of origin, and to do so by orders of magnitude. Excavations in the 1990s along the Yangtze drainage by Chinese and foreign archaeologists, especially Richard S. McNeish, show us that the agricultural revolution was well along by 14,000 years ago, and by 10,000 years ago rice paddy agriculture was being invented. This irreversible release of huge quantities of agricultural surplus laid the basis for rapid population expansion. This rapid rise in population numbers meant the absolute concomitant necessity of immediate, thoroughgoing, and dramatic transition to increasingly effective simple chiefdom society. And such societies always feature intensive professional specialization of many productive tasks. Furthermore, they always feature the early application of true labor power to agriculture and other handicraft industries. The challenge was the sheer numbers of people. In nuclear China, there were far greater numbers of people than in any of the other centers of origin of the slave stage. Now we come to the question of advanced theocratic chiefdoms. Abstracted, homogenized, socially necessary labor time is emerging, which is to say the new economic category of labor power. From now on, it will be this proto-labor power, which is the principal form of human labor, setting the standard for our formula. Not that concrete human individual laboring activity ceases. Far from it. But it is the new category of labor power as applied to technology, which sets the pace, acting as the common denominator for the payment of value one, even to those who are not part of the category of collectively applied, temporally measured group labor. From this point forward in history, what is obtainable by the individual will be measured by what the collective labor of corvées, or forced labor, slaves, convicts, captured peoples, has to be paid in food and shelter, that is the cost of their minimal subsistence. However, the seeds of the destruction of this order are also very much in place. Religion has temporarily solved the problem of labor discipline, obtaining voluntary compliance with the theocrat's production plan in the production of surplus, which is no longer surplus but now a definite necessity. But in so doing, the practitioners of religion have set themselves up as a factor or a new social rank, exacerbating the increasingly complex division of social production. No matter how this increasingly acute struggle over social produce is resolved, it is likely that the poorest people will get the shit end of the stick. Now let us look at how our formula says that the surplus value column is subdividing in the final chiefdom stage, and I'll just bring your attention to that column called surplus value, underneath which we now have four different categories, four different subcolumns: storage, support, profit, and theocrats. In other words, that's where the surplus value is being divided. And then I go through the relative, all of the definitions of terms again, which you can get easily enough by going back to the chapter on advanced theocratic chiefdoms, looking at the formula in volume 1. Now, the Bathala religion. In all advanced theocratic chiefdoms, it is religion that temporarily solves the problem of labor discipline in the production of surplus, now a definite necessity, but sets itself up as a factor exacerbating the increasingly complex division of social production. In the Philippine advanced theocratic chiefdoms, it is the Bathala religion, in a variety of forms, depending on the island, that teaches obedience to the theocrats. Monumental architecture, for example, pyramids, urban platform complexes, and Nazca lines, are archaeological hallmarks of all ATC stage societies. Such construction is the real-world manifestation of religious tenets holding the masses of ignorant farming families in line, and in the Philippines we have the construction of temple complexes. However, eventually all the explanation and persuasion of the theocrats in justifying the social order, the unequal division and distribution of surplus social product, the bullshit, in other words, from the priests and priestesses will be insufficient. It will eventually fail to assuage the anger and insight of the mass of farmers and lower-ranked laborer specialists. This is the locus of the general crisis of the stage of advanced theocratic chiefdoms. That is, on the one hand, society must have the theocrats to stay together. On the other hand, the priests are also simultaneously exacerbating the inherent unjust nature of society in the process of dividing against itself. The institutionalized inequality between the haves and have-nots reaches the breaking point. The theocrats are contributing to this splitting of society by helping themselves to the maximum. In the Philippines, the autochthonous process was cut short by the arrival of Spanish feudalists. They imposed their religion on the peoples of the Philippines as they had on the peoples of the New World. Whenever and wherever a crisis arises that puts too many people between a rock and a hard place, and the resolution attempted by the center is blatantly unfair, Ma and Pa Kettle will gather round with their fellow rubes and revolt. Then either they will tear society apart in a rank war, or some will flee to begin life again in a simpler way, in lands far from the home region. Alternatively, a new solution will appear to the civil conflict. What can that new solution be? The answer is the state. The state is the army and police in the pay of the richest families. It exists to compel obedience from the poor families. That is what the state means in scientific terms, and should not be confused with government, which existed before the state and which will exist after the state withers away. The emergence of armed force in the very private pay of a few financially powerful families and/or ranks of the old theocratic chiefdoms is the origin of all states. When the state emerges, then true class society has also emerged. Ranks have been transmuted into classes. The ruling classes will domesticate the rest of society. In the Philippines, population expansion in coastal regions soon reached a point where substantial authority had to be given to the center. To support the center, a professional priest class arose with the Bathala cults preaching social unity. In other words, to overcome the challenge, the simple chiefdoms had to remain in place and intensify internal processes, as there was nowhere to migrate. Those persons in the center, with the new ideology of selfish acquisition motivating them, had only to advocate doing what was clearly essential and doing it in place. The Philippines witnessed autochthonous evolution of honey gathering since at least 90,000 years ago. It experienced the broad spectrum of wild resource exploitation mode of production in its advanced Paleolithic, at least in Palawan. This evolved indigenously into the tribal agricultural stage. Then outsiders arrived in the same final phase of primitive communism and absorbed or were absorbed by the local populations. Tribal agriculture as a mode of production has within it the seeds of its own dialectical transformation, and the first stage of the transition is the simple chiefdom. Its final stage is the stage of advanced theocratic chiefdoms. Then the arrival of feudal stage Spaniards cut autochthonous development short. Laura Lee Junker says, quote, while Chinese sources often inflated the scale and complexity of Philippine chiefdoms, contact period Spanish accounts almost discount any centralized political authority. After their conquests in Mesoamerica and South America, where vast empires could be secured by the strategic kidnap of godlike kings, the Spaniards were unprepared for the difficulty of securing widely scattered islands controlled by a dizzying array of continually battling chiefs who seemed to have no permanent political hierarchies and spoke mutually unintelligible languages. At the time of Magellan's discovery, there were no more than 500,000 people in the Philippines. An early enumeration of the population made by the Spaniards in 1591, which included practically all of these tribes outside the Muslim South that were not under Spanish control, gave a population of less than 700,000. The Spanish expeditions found many coasts and islands in the Bisayan group without inhabitants at all, and occasionally a sail or a canoe would be seen, and then these would disappear in some small estero or mangrove swamp, and the land seemed as unpopulated as before. At certain points, like Limasana, Butuan, and Bohol, the natives were more numerous, and Cebu was a large and thriving community. Generally speaking, however, the Spaniards had to search for settled places and cultivated lands. The Spanish reports say the Filipinos of the Central Islands and Luzon's western coast were past the clan stage, by which they seemed to mean that in the Philippines they encountered people they thought of as having a feudalist type of political organization under local chiefs. These are what we call today ATCs, Advanced Theocratic Chiefdoms. The Spanish reports are of systems of laws or customs administered by councils of old men. These accounts report writing based on a phonetic alphabet with at least one person in each community that could read and write. Chinese writings often give the impression that the tributary polities were of great magnitude, complexity, and regional integration. The Chinese impression of the Philippine political landscape is one dominated by a few large-scale polities with powerful and wealthy rulers controlling vast riches. During the late 10th to early 11th centuries AD, Butuan on northern Mindanao and Mai on northern Mindoro were extensive Philippine kingdoms surrounded by so-called barbarian peoples. Puman was considered equivalent to the large Vietnamese state of Champa. Now there is archaeological evidence for extensive coastal settlement outside these centers. There are Chinese records from the late 14th to early 15th century AD tributary trade peak. They describe Old Manila, now buried under modern Manila, Sula on Jolo Island in the Sulu Sea, and Maguindanao at Cotabato on Mindanao Island as large centralized polities surrounded by barbarians. There is archaeological evidence for substantial polities being heavily involved in the China luxury goods trade at Cebu, Tangier, Batanes, and other historically unrecorded locales. The Chinese learned of Philippine polities from richly dressed chiefs with elaborate court entourages and had little or no knowledge of how these chiefs lived at home. A higher development of the barangay was the community whose chief had acquired the title of Raja, and which we will be discussing more in the next lecture on the early slave stage. Such was the Raja Humabon of Cebu, the principal trading port in the central Visayas. The early Malay communities gradually developed into a complex patchwork which included the Rajanates of Butuan in Cebu, influenced by the powerful Hindu empires in Java and Sumatra, the kingdoms of Manila, Namayan, and Tondo, and the sultanates of Maguindanao and Sulu. In the south, the Sultanate of Sulu persists today, and the kingdom of Maguindanao would be called a sultanate. The other entities did not long survive contact with Spain. A ruler was called a Raja. The specific epithet Raja in Malay means king. Laura Lee Junker and others have settled on the term polity to describe these Rajas-ruled entities, which is fine since Marxist theory uses the term kingdom to describe sociocultural diagnostics, not those of size and hectare. As an encounter between Miguel Lopez de Legazpi of Spain and the Sultan Suleiman of Manila and his uncle Sultan Lacandola, the chief of Tondo, is said to have been illuminated in one report. It describes the scale of some of these polities. These sultans lived in communities a few miles apart, and they commanded forces of 100 warriors apiece. The time always comes in the life of every simple chiefdom when voluntary internal association of farming families must be reinforced. That reinforcement takes the form of some kind of unifying religion, and this religion preaches the voluntary giving over of authority to the central leadership and has a cult of priests, priestesses, and the necessary magic to control the rubes. In the Philippines, that religion was Bathalism. Analysis of the earthenware pottery recovered from the excavation in the Bais region of eastern Negros Island in the central Philippines reveals the existence of trade between the Philippines and its neighbors. Laura Lee Junker has proven a centralized control of an interregional system of production, exchange, and resource mobilization in the operation of this economy. It also included trade between the Philippine chiefdoms and slave stage kingdoms and empires of mainland Asia. That trade began in the 10th century AD and intensified just before the coming of the Spaniards in the 15th and 16th centuries AD. Studies indicate that lowland produced earthenware varied from region to region before the coming of foreign luxury trade goods in the 10th century AD. After the emergence of foreign trade, archaeological evidences show earthenware that was more or less standardized. This indicates a change in pottery production modes, from scattered household production to full-time, large-scale production. These changes in pottery production, according to Junker, may be linked to a powerful lowland government which tried to gain control of upland raw material acquisition for improved participation in foreign trade. At the time of European contact, the coastlines of most of the major Philippine islands and some regions already had numerous advanced theocratic chiefdoms with terminal social stratification. In other words, they were just decades away from true division into classes and the concomitant emergence of armed force in the very private hands of the rulers. So they were quite capable of understanding what the Spaniards were all about and of resisting attempts to impose foreign class-state rule. Members of the chiefly class played a central role in the administration of a complex regional economy. The chiefs controlled agricultural livelihood by restricting land tenure. They mobilized surplus through a system of tribute payments and gained wealth through sponsorships of raiding or trading expeditions for sources of commodities like porcelain and jewelry. They used this wealth for building political alliances with other chiefdoms. Aside from mobilizing the production of lowland agriculturalists under their direct sovereignty, Philippine chiefs facilitated exchange between lowlanders and interior slash-and-burn tribal agriculturalists and even the still more primitive hunter-gatherer tribes. Resources gained from this upland-lowland trade included metal ores and forest products and were consumed in ATC commodity production and trade. These chiefdoms, being located near the ocean, were prone to sea attacks. Against this threat, they built castles and fortifications called ijangs. Their ruins abound today. Among this prehistoric monumental architecture are those well preserved in the Batanes, the northernmost region of the country. Ijangs are hills with shaven tops from which to repel invaders. Unearthed within the vicinity of the ijangs are burnt wood and pottery. These artifacts have been excavated from the ashes of Mount Araya after its eruption around 350 BC. Now, finally, with regard to international trade, Chinese texts and archaeological data from Philippine sites suggest an intensive long-distance trade between Philippine chiefdoms and China. The trade reached its peak during the 15th and 16th centuries AD, and the Philippine chiefs were primarily interested in obtaining porcelains, silk, magnetite mirrors, and gold jewelry from the Chinese traders. These luxury goods were objects of wealth in the households of the elite and as grave furnishings of high-ranked persons. The Chinese traders were paid in products of the interior forests. In particular, payment was made in metal ores, forest hardwood, and rosins. This proves a direct link of the coastal polities with the internal lowland-upland trade, since the forest products could only be obtained from internal trade networks. The most noticeable archaeological fact of late Philippine prehistory is the abundant presence of glazed Asiatic trade pottery that appears in the archaeological record sometime around 1000 AD. Over the succeeding 600 years, trade ware types in the Philippine archaeological sites change dramatically. A tiny handful of wares in Mindanao date to the late Chinese Tang dynasty, which was AD 618 to AD 907. Wares dating to the early Sung period, AD 960 to 1126, are quite rare. Pottery imports increased rapidly during the late Sung, AD 1127 to 1279, and Yuan, AD 1280 to 1368 periods. The Yuan dynasty was a period where there was an increase in pottery import during the 15th and 16th centuries, and of the Ming dynasty, AD 1369 to 1640. A set of cheap utilitarian wares consisting primarily of small bowls and dishes and a few forms of soft-bodied wares emerges to be sold to proto-proletarians and peasants. During the 13th and 14th centuries AD, there appeared also layout for Sunday bourgeois and petty bourgeois delicate wares. Among the latter, some demonstrate new South Chinese kiln developments in manufacturing techniques and decoration. Among these items were fine white porcelains of the Yingqing and Shufu variety. There were also wares with underglazed decoration in the form of dark brown spots executed in iron pigments and delicate stylized paintings in copper and blue. At this time, blue and white porcelain was well established as a stylistic form and dominated the wares found in the Philippines. On the other hand, the imported pottery was low quality, mass-produced, blue and white items targeted for sale to proto-proletarians and peasants. And that brings our discussion of the chiefdom transition and the Marxist analysis of it from Karl Marx to me to a conclusion. And in the next lecture we're going to take up the coming of the slave stage in the Philippines, the appearance of the Spaniards, and so forth.